Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Superfly ball python. The Superfly consists of the Fire and the Super Pastel. It's a really popular combination. If you actually go to a reptile show and you're looking for snakes at the show and you look at the display cases, most times they'll actually list it as a Superfly, assuming that you know the genes in the mix that it's actually a Super Pastel and a Fire. And it's a pretty amazing combination. The Super Pastel is usually pretty bright yellow and it really scrambles up the pattern, and then when you add Fire to the mix, it really cleans it up. Fire is generally considered a lightening gene, so sometimes it'll lighten it up a little bit, and sometimes it really keeps a really bright yellow. And when you work other genes into the Superfly, you can make some pretty amazing combinations. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Superfly ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the genes that make up the Superfly. And the first one I want to show you is the Super Pastel. This is actually 2 copies of the codominant pastel gene. And when you actually have 2 copies of the pastel, it'll actually really jumble up the pattern. Pretty amazing pattern enhancement. And I'd say this is probably up there with like the leopard or the spot nose or the confusion as far as really jumbling up the pattern. It's a really strong pattern enhancer. And a lot of times on the Super Pastel, especially in combinations, you can usually tell you have Super Pastel from the faded out head. That is pretty much a dead giveaway that you have Super Pastel in the mix. And here is another gene in the Superfly, and that is the Fire. And the Fire is kind of interesting. It's actually in the black-eyed leucistic complex. So if you actually took 2 Fires and bred them together, 25% of the time you get an all-white snake with black eyes. So a lot of times with an all-white snake, it'll actually mask all the other genes in the combination. So a lot of people sometimes they actually try to avoid mixing Fire with Fire, because if you actually get the all-white snake, especially if you have a lot of other genes in the combination, it can completely mask all the other genes. Although the Super Fires are really awesome. And a lot of Super Fires, the all-white snake, a lot of times it'll have a little bit of kind of an orangish yellow. Sometimes it's yellow, sometimes it's kind of an orangish yellow, just little spots right on the top of the white snake, which is pretty awesome. I'd say probably the Super Fire is one of my favorite all-white snakes. It's pretty awesome. So here's what happens if you take Fire and you work it into Super Pastel. This is what you get. You get the Superfly. Pretty amazing combination. And this is essentially pretty much the same as the Firefly. The Firefly is 1 copy of the Pastel and 1 copy of the Fire. So it is the Pastel Fire. And then you just add another copy of Pastel and you get the Superfly. And essentially what it is it almost looks exactly like a Firefly, except it really scrambles up the pattern. It's pretty amazing. And usually with the Fireflies and the Superflies, as they age and mature, they really hold their brightness quite a bit. You know, some pastels, if you have like a really bright pastel, sometimes it can kind of brown out as it ages and matures. And it seems like for some reason between the combination between Fire and Pastel, the Fire really seems like it retains the brightness of the pastel as it ages. It's kind of interesting. So I kind of wanted to show you some other genes we can work into the Superfly to make some really impressive combinations. And probably one of my favorites is working Pinstripe into the Superfly. And this is the Pinstripe. This is one of my favorite genes. Some of these Pinstripes can be really super bright gold. Sometimes they almost look like metallic snakes. It is pretty amazing. I actually produced some here in my collection, and it was almost hard to sell. They are so awesome and so bright gold. And essentially what the Pinstripe is a lot of times it'll actually have this really solid line right down the top, and sometimes it'll have little tiny, almost like pinstripes right down the sides, and sometimes you can actually see like little, almost like scrunched together alien heads on the sides. It's pretty awesome. And a Pinstripe is a dominant gene. If you actually breed it to something else, 50% of the offspring come out as Pinstripe, although there has been rumors that the Pinstripe could be codominant and you could produce a Super, which is kind of interesting. After all these years, I've actually seen a couple over on Morphmarket, people showing a Super Pinstripe, which looks pretty much exactly like 1 copy of the Pinstripe, but if it was a Super and you bred it to something else, all the offspring would come out as Pinstripe. That's kind of interesting. So here's what happens if you work Pinstripe into the Superfly. Take a look at this crazy snake. This is what they call the sherbet fly, which is a really crazy combination. I'd say this is probably the best sherbet fly that I've ever seen. As a matter of fact, if this was still for sale, I'd probably buy it. How much did this thing sell for? This actually sold for $650. Pretty crazy. And this was a mature female. Looks like it was almost ready to breed. Kind of a crazy combination. And usually when you mix the super pastel with the pinstripe, you really get a shattered pattern. It's pretty amazing. Essentially what it is, they call it the killer blast or the super blast with the super pastel and the pinstripe. And then when you add the fire to it, you get the sherbet fly. And a lot of times the fire will really like clean it up and really brighten the yellow a lot of times, and a lot of times it'll remove a lot of pixelation in the background. And this is a really amazing thing. Almost looks like someone sprinkled pepper over it or something. Really amazing combination. So here is the puzzle. The puzzle, I'd say, is not very common and it's pretty expensive. It's pretty amazing how the puzzle's really held its price point over the last 5 years, pretty much since I've been in ball pythons. And kind of the weird thing is I remember when I was first starting into ball pythons and I look at a snake, I was like, yeah, that has, you know, pretty much the same color as a normal. It just a little bit scrambled up pattern. If you actually look at the prices on these are pretty expensive. This one actually sold, this one's still for sale. It's actually a 2020. This is for sale, $1,750. Pretty crazy. And a lot of times just looking at the puzzles, you don't realize the ultimate potential of the puzzle. It's actually a recessive gene. And when you work other genes into the puzzle, you can make some really crazy combinations. So here's what happens if you take the puzzle and work in the Superfly. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is the ultimate potential of the puzzle. It's kind of amazing how you see some of these morphs as a standalone gene and they don't really look that impressive, and then you start mixing them into combinations and you pop out some crazy looking snakes like this. This is like nothing I've ever seen over here on Morphmarket. This is probably an expensive snake too. This one actually sold for $4,000. That is pretty crazy. As a matter of fact, at some point I'm thinking about maybe picking up a couple het puzzles. It's actually recessive, so you need 2 copies of the gene for a puzzle. Puzzle is pretty amazing. Here is the banana, and the banana is really popular. A lot of people think that the banana is pretty much the same thing as the coral glow, and I would tend to agree. I think they're pretty much the same gene. And the banana it's really visually dominant. When you work it into other combinations, usually you can see a really strong effect of the banana. Sometimes it can be almost overwhelming to where it'll completely eliminate all the other genes. I've actually produced a pastel coral glow here in my collection. I could not see the pastel. It was like buried in the coral glows. I had to sell them as coral glows, possible pastels, because it's so visually dominant. And here's what happens if you work banana into the Superfly. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing that it actually complements the Superfly really well. And in this case, you actually see a pretty good balance between the banana and the Superfly breaking through, which is a pretty amazing combination. If you're wondering about the prices on some of these Superflies, they're not that expensive. They're not like, you know, the crazy. This one actually sold for $300, which is a pretty good price for the banana super pastel fire. So here is the Enchi. The Enchi is pretty interesting as a standalone gene. A lot of times it can have these tiger stripes, which is pretty interesting. Sometimes it doesn't have the tiger stripes. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more jumbled up. And essentially a lot of people think that the Enchi is a pattern reducing gene. A lot of times when you work it into combos, it'll take the pattern and it'll kind of reduce it to kind of like an abbreviated pattern, kind of shrink it down a little bit. But the cool thing about the Enchi is in a lot of combinations when you work in Enchi, you actually bring out a lot of the oranges in the combination. That's actually not only a pattern enhancing gene, but it also enhances the color of a lot of combinations. And here's what happens if you work Enchi into the Superfly. Take a look at this. This is a crazy combination. This is pretty amazing. So essentially what's happening is the Enchi, sometimes the Enchi brings out more oranges and sometimes it brings out a lot more yellows. And you can see in this case, you actually have 2 copies of the pastel and the fire lightens it a little, but I think the Enchi kind of reverses the lightning, and then the fire really brings out kind of the smoothness and really cleans up the pattern to where you don't get a lot of pixelation in the background. That is a pretty crazy thing. So here is the calico, and let me tell you, I actually have produced quite a few calicos in my collection, and it's a pretty amazing gene. I really like it with a lot of combos, and as a standalone gene, it can be pretty variable. Sometimes you can see like a little bit of white coming up the sides here, and sometimes you can see, you know, like big splotches of white with a sharp definition between the whites and the colors. Sometimes it can be pretty variable. And here's what happens if you were calico into the Superfly. Take a look at this crazy thing. That is really pretty amazing. And it's pretty amazing with the calicos. A lot of times when you produce calicos as hatchlings, I'd say they're not really that impressive until they get a little bit of age on them. And it seems like the older they get, the more they have the higher the contrast, and the whites seem like they get a little bit whiter as they age and mature. They just seem like they look better and better as they age. And this one, you can definitely tell it has some age on it. It's looking really good. So this is kind of an interesting combo. This is actually an axanthic. This is the TSK line of axanthic. And essentially what axanthic does is it strips out all the color in the ball python, pretty much leaving you a black and white and silver snake. Sometimes you can see a little bit of kind of like this black pixelation. Sometimes you can see a little bit of browns in some of your axanthics. But other than that, they pretty much strip out all the other color. And kind of the cool thing working the axanthic into the Superfly is if you actually add pastel and fire to the axanthic, what it really does is it really brightens up the white part of the snake, really makes it super clean and bright. Here's what happens if you take the axanthic and work it into the Superfly. Take a look at this. This is a pretty amazing combination. And some of these axanthics can be really super expensive, especially when you're working in like the super pastel and the fire and make them like a really high contrast like this. And these, if you actually wonder around the price on this one actually sold back in 2018 for $4,000. Pretty crazy for some of these axanthics. All right, so here's the last one I want to show you. This is pretty interesting, not very common either. This is the acid. I'm actually thinking about getting into this project maybe next year, and a lot of people think that the acid is the same as the static gene or the confusion gene. A lot of people think they're pretty much the same thing or different lines of the same gene, and as a standalone gene, it's kind of interesting. It almost kind of looks maybe like a leopard, a little bit more reduced of a pattern than a leopard. If you actually look at the belly of the acid, it has a really crazy belly, which a lot of times it'll have a really strong black line right down the middle of the belly, which is really kind of unusual. Most ball pythons have a pretty clear belly, like right down the middle of the belly. And the acid, usually when you mix it with other combinations, it really explodes the pattern. It makes for some really unexpected combinations. So here's what happens if you take the acid and you work it into the Superfly. Take a look at this crazy snake. And that is the potential of the acid. Pretty much, I've seen pretty much the same effect with the confusion and the static. It really just explodes the pattern. Pretty amazing. And a lot of times on the acid, you'll also see it, a lot of times it seems like it's a dark gene, and it really darkens the background of the combination. You can see on the top of this one, it really has this dark line on either side of the line, and I think that is coming from the influence of the acid. Pretty amazing combination. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Deadman Omega Gaming asks, why shouldn't you feed your ball python live rodents its entire life? And that is a very good question. So when it comes to feeding live, I've actually seen some people that's pretty much all they've fed for the entire life of their ball python. But I found there's definitely dangers associated with feeding live. The rodent can actually really hurt your ball python in some cases. And it's kind of interesting. I actually started with frozen thawed and did frozen thawed through my whole collection. And I actually, at one point, I switched to all live. And for some reason, ball pythons just prefer to eat live runs. It's like they want to hunt, they don't want to be fed. And it's so much easier if you're breeding the rodents to actually just pick up a rodent and then move it over to a rack and pop it in until you actually go over to the reptile forums and start reading some of the stories where some of the rodents actually hurt the ball pythons, like taking out an eye or something like that. And let me tell you, once you start reading those stories, you'll want to go back to frozen thawed as soon as possible. I pretty much do frozen thawed as much as I can. I only do live on the really stubborn feeders, and when I do feed live, it's usually a really small rat that they can definitely overpower. You definitely don't want a rat that's too big in there when you're trying to feed a ball python. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.